No one ever imagined that a girl like me, an orphan, could have once been the youngest creative director in the history of a prestigious media company in New York, and no one could have guessed that the person I trusted the most would be the one to trigger my downward spiral in my career. It all began in a small office on the 10th floor of an old building in Soho, where the afternoon light filtering through the windows made me feel lucky every time I stayed late to adjust every line of content and every color in the final design. My name is Savannah James, 31 years old, and until a few months ago, I thought I had found a second home at Collins & Partners, a place where I poured all my youthful energy into turning invisible projects into viral campaigns, using my strength emotion-driven marketing. Not everyone understands the true value of emotions when conveyed through words or images, but I've always believed that when you tap into the truth in people's hearts, the product is no longer just a product. It becomes a connection, and I built my entire career on that belief, step by step, from being an anonymous intern to having my name on some of the largest proposals sent to global clients. Jason Collins was the one who brought me into that company. He was the CEO, the son of the founder, and the first man to make me believe that not every relationship in the workplace was transactional. We kept our relationship private for 2 years, as we both thought maintaining clear boundaries was the right thing to do. Barbara Collins, his mother, and the company's honorary chairwoman, never hid her dislike for me. She was always annoyed whenever I was recognized, or when clients praised the campaigns I led. According to her, I was just a lucky person with good communication skills, not someone who should be at the strategic decision-making table, but I never paid attention to her. I believed in the work I was doing, in the value I brought, in Jason, and in the team that I thought we were all rowing the same boat together. Perhaps it was that trust that made the fall later on even harder to recover from. Our biggest campaign of the year was called The New Normal, a project to reposition the brand for a nationwide network of psychiatric hospitals after the pandemic. I was the one who came up with the original concept, wrote the brief, presented it to the client, and then, with the creative team, turned it into a plan that the client approved after the very first pitch. I still remember that day, the look in Jason's eyes, shining with pride. "We're going to make something unprecedented," he said, like a promise. But what I didn't expect was that promises are sometimes just a part of a strategy. When the campaign's launch event took place in front of the media and the entire board of directors, I sat in the second row, nameless, unintroduced. Then, the person who spoke to kick off the presentation, the one who was called the mastermind behind this successful campaign, was Heather Whitfield, a familiar face at social events, a close friend of Jason's mother, and recently hired as a strategic advisor with no formal process. I sat still, watching as Heather presented my idea, the slides I had stayed up countless nights perfecting. No one called my name during the recognition. No one looked in my direction. Even Jason only held my hand lightly before turning to pat Heather on the back as if that was the only logical thing to do. I can't remember how I left the auditorium that day. On my way back, my phone buzzed with a message from Barbara. "Welcome to reality. Savannah, this company has no room for emotions, only for people who know their place." I laughed, but tears started to fall. I thought of the nights I stayed late perfecting those presentation slides, the countless times I edited TVC segments for clients just to make everything perfect. I had believed that true value would eventually be recognized, that when you worked with all your heart, justice would prevail. But that was a story meant for those with enough privilege. As for me, I was just a girl with no background, no connections, not the kind of woman Barbara wanted her son to marry, and certainly not the kind of person the company wanted as its representative. I tried to find Jason the next day to ask him directly, but he just briefly said that this decision was part of a communication strategy, and that I should understand that this wasn't the time to create more instability. I didn't know what hurt more, losing my effort or losing the person I thought would walk with me to the end. 2 days later, I submitted my resignation. No one stopped me. No emails. No thank yous. Everything ended as quickly as if I had never existed in their success story. But what hurt the most was when I discovered an internal email between Heather and Barbara, leaked by a technical employee who mistakenly sent it to me. In it, they discussed removing me from the project to avoid dependence on someone with unstable mental health. Barbara wrote that I tended to be too sensitive and used my circumstances to demand special privileges. Heather was more subtle, suggesting create a small scandal about internal security violations to have an excuse to handle it. I had thought they only disliked me quietly, but the truth was, they had been planning to push me out all along. Jason, the one who once held my hand and promised we would do something great, knew it all and stayed silent. I moved out of my rented apartment near the company's headquarters, cutting off all contact with friends in the industry, even those I had once worked closely with on major campaigns. I no longer trusted anyone. I no longer believed in so-called lasting relationships. I no longer believed that lost trust could be restored. I lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn, with no schedule, no plan. I thought I just needed to rest for a few weeks, but those weeks turned into months. Eventually, I couldn't even bear to look at my own portfolio. I avoided mirrors, avoided social media, avoided any inquiries from those who still remembered me. I had once been invited to speak about entrepreneurship and emotional marketing, but now I was just a name erased from all the internal data of my former company. A girl who had been betrayed, who trusted the wrong people, who once believed that being good enough would be enough to hold on to her place. I had once thought I wouldn't return, but an unexpected event forced me to open my laptop, which had gathered dust for months. A strange email, no subject, no signature, but the message was just one line. They haven't stopped. Get up. Savannah. I had grown accustomed to silence. The days after leaving my former company were spent in a small apartment with just enough light, an old wooden table, and the laptop I once considered a close companion. When that email appeared, no subject, no signature, just one awakening sentence. It took me nearly half a day to decide to reopen the hard drive. On the screen were files that I had once considered my legacy campaigns that never launched, concepts rejected for not being safe enough, and projects I had longed to bring to life with my heart. I wasn't sure if I was ready to return, but for the first time in months, I felt my hands shaking for a reason other than fear. I needed to know who had sent the email and why they knew that they hadn't stopped, that they in that sentence. I didn't even need to guess, it was obvious. Barbara Collins never did anything halfway. And if there was one thing I knew about people like her, it was that they would never let someone who had once embarrassed them live peacefully outside their sphere of influence. I began checking industry news channels, closed forums, internal job postings, and noticed something strange. Over the past 3 months, Collins and Partners had been constantly hiring for content strategy positions, but hadn't kept anyone for more than 3 weeks. Rumors circulated about internal chaos, and the New Normal campaign was suspected of stealing ideas from a freelancer who had worked remotely. Heather still appeared at major events, but usually avoided the press, while Jason remained completely silent. That reminded me of a note I had written in an old folder, where I had sketched out a branch for the campaign, a section that had never been implemented because of last-minute budget cuts. Now, I saw it being reused in a new campaign launch by Collins and Partners for a major pharmaceutical company, nearly identical. I didn't need to guess much. I knew who was behind it, and that's when a new feeling began to rise in me, no longer pain or resentment, but an odd urge. I no longer wanted to reclaim my old reputation. I wanted to create something new, something that would make people unable to mention this industry without thinking of Savannah James. I started rewriting my entrepreneurial plan from the ashes of what I had lost. A small company, working as an independent studio, specializing in emotional marketing campaigns, but not chasing short-term trends. I called it Canvas, as a reminder to myself that each project is a blank canvas that needs to be listened to before it is colored. I didn't have much capital, just some savings, and a few old friends who had also left after seeing the true face of Collins and Partners. Among them was David, an old friend of Jason's, who had quietly helped me recover some personal documents after I was locked out of internal access. David didn't ask why I was coming back. He simply said that the industry needed people who truly did the work. And so I began again from a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn, hiring freelancers per project, doing everything myself from pitching to finalizing the files. The early days weren't easy. No one wanted to bet on a name tainted by a document leak scandal. Even though I had never confirmed or denied it, I sent out dozens of proposals, many of which went unanswered, and many were outright rejected with the excuse of not aligning with the brand's direction. There were times when I wanted to delete everything I was trying to build because everything felt too heavy. But then one morning, while checking my spam folder, I found an email from a nonprofit in the southern United States, a group that had approached me 3 years ago for a fundraising campaign that had been rejected by my old company for not delivering sufficient media value. They said they remembered me because of the way I had listened to the stories of each child in their old report. They wanted me to redesign the entire emotional campaign, from the stories to the videos and community call to action. It wasn't a huge financial deal, but it was the first time in months that I was called by my real name and trusted unconditionally. The project exceeded expectations, raising 3 times its original fundraising goal and being shared by the recipients themselves. I didn't use paid ads. I didn't invite influencers. I just told real stories in a real voice and let the real people speak of their experiences. From there, I began receiving invitations to collaborate from small startups, independent creative groups, and those who, like me, had been victims of old power structures. Canvas grew into a network of those who were overlooked but chose to lift each other up. I still held one principle. I wouldn't work with anyone who had contributed to building the system that had cast me aside. But then one day, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was calm but clear. It was Catherine Henderson, Jason's ex-girlfriend, now the CEO of an angel investment fund. She said she knew what Heather had done and wanted to fund Canvas's expansion if I had a specific plan. I didn't respond right away. I just asked one question: "Why are you helping me?" And she replied, "Because I was once the one who was compared. I know what that feels like." I spent the whole night thinking. Catherine's offer was an opportunity for Canvas to reach a new level, but it also meant I would be stepping back into a world where the old names still held power. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it or to forgive. But then I remembered the first sentence in that nameless email sent to me, "Get up." And I understood that if I didn't stand up, someone else would continue to be pushed down. The next morning, I sent Catherine a detailed plan. I called it the True Value Project, a series of collaborative campaigns with social brands to honor the untold stories. And I decided that in the launch of the first project, I would invite a special guest to the stage, not a celebrity, but someone who had once been a bartender at major events, someone who had witnessed more than people thought, someone who had looked at me with pity when she saw Heather receiving praise for my idea. This time, I needed the truth to speak, and I would let the truth lead the way in my comeback. There is a peculiar kind of peace when you start doing something not to prove yourself to anyone, but simply to affirm that you didn't let the pain destroy the best part of you. But peace is always the most fragile thing when you are close to the light. After receiving the investment from Katherine Henderson, my small team at Canvas, and I began rolling out the True Value Project across 3 cities, places where communities had long been ignored by the media because they didn't create the beautiful statistics people wanted. We collected stories from migrant workers, single mothers, and children who had fallen through the cracks of the education system. Every story was told in their own voices, with no edits to make them fit the media narrative, no shaping them to follow advertising logic. I believed in authentic emotional marketing and the power of belief to spread a message. The campaign began to gain momentum, not just in the communities, but also in the mainstream media. A trade magazine called Canvas, the last true storyteller in an age of appearances. And then, what I had been waiting for arrived. At an annual media event, the organizers decided to invite Canvas to present the journey of building sustainable campaigns from the roots of the community. I was invited to the main stage, along with representatives from other major agencies, including Heather Whitfield. The moment I stepped into that auditorium, what I felt wasn't nervousness, but a chilling clarity. Everything seemed to slow down. The lights no longer felt glaring. The laughter no longer threw me off beat. I could see Heather's face clearly as she spotted me from afar, her eyes widening slightly before she quickly turned away as if she hadn't seen anything. I didn't approach her, only nodding briefly if our eyes met, but I knew that my presence today was enough to create a crack in the shell they had worked so hard to build. That presentation wasn't a confrontation, but the audience seemed to sense the contrast between 2 approaches to media. One side was driven by data strategy, target audiences, and persuasive investment. The other was the story of real people with real values, expressed in the most natural emotional language. I didn't mention my former company, didn't name anyone, but when I concluded my speech with the line, "If you don't believe in the story you're telling, no matter how advanced the techniques, the audience will see through the artifice," the room went silent for a beat. I left the stage with a feeling of lightness, not because I had won, but because I was no longer bound by the past. But that night, I received a strange message, no contact number, just an image attached. In the photo was the main office of Collins and Partners, with a notice of temporary closure. Before I could process what was happening, I got a call from David, his voice low and fast, telling me to turn on the TV. The news reported that Collins and Partners was under internal investigation for allegations of using unverified intellectual property in both the New Normal campaign and 2 recent campaigns. An anonymous complaint had been filed with evidence and original strategic document, with timestamps and metadata matching my former internal account. At that moment, I understood why I had received that first email. Someone inside the system couldn't take it anymore and chose to stand by the truth. The news spread quickly. With media outlets picking up the story, several former employees began to speak out, including a young design staff member who had worked closely with me. He revealed that Heather had asked him to alter documents without citing sources, and when he suggested asking for permission, he was transferred to another department the very next week. Jason didn't appear in any statements, and Barbara was filmed leaving the headquarters in silence. I wasn't happy, nor did I feel any satisfaction, but I felt light, as if, for the first time, I no longer had to carry the question, do people know the truth? I knew this wasn't the end yet, because people like Barbara would never let a simple failure bring down their entire system. And just as I had predicted, a few days later, I received an invitation to meet with her through an intermediary assistant. I declined the hotel meeting, instead choosing a small cafe where I had once started rewriting my life. Barbara arrived right on time, carefully made up and maintaining her controlled exterior. She sat across from me, silent for a moment before speaking directly. "I want you to stop." I smiled. a smile without defensiveness. I didn't start this, but I won't pretend not to know anymore. Our conversation was a silent chess match. Barbara offered to buy a stake in Canvas through an anonymous fund in exchange for my agreement not to pursue any lawsuits against Collins and Partners. I refused, not because I wanted to continue the fight, but because I no longer needed anything from that old system. I didn't build Canvas to compete. I built it to create a space where people like me weren't looked down upon because of our background, our emotions, or the way we stayed true to our craft. On my way out, she left me with a phrase that stuck with me. You'll see, emotions won't keep customers. I didn't respond, but I knew if the only thing that can still hold a person is genuine emotion, then that is something worth holding on to. At the same time, Jason made his first appearance on social media after weeks of silence. He wrote a long post saying he had no knowledge of the use of my materials, that he only learned of it after everything was exposed. The post was shared by many, but no one talked about his innocence. His silence in the past was the clearest answer. A man who had promised to protect me chose safety when I needed him the most. No need for accusations, because there are some things that should only be recalled in the heart, so they don't repeat. During the investigation of Collins and Partners, many partners pulled out, and employees left in droves. Heather disappeared from the industry, and Barbara announced her resignation as honorary chairwoman. The things that once elevated them were now the very things that led to their fall. And in the midst of that, Canvas entered a phase of rapid growth, being invited to consult for many brands wanting to shift toward true storytelling rather than just chasing numbers. The new clients came, not because I was the one who had been betrayed, but because I had made a spectacular comeback, standing firm on the true values I pursued. I do not think I have forgiven, but one day, standing on the rooftop of Canvas's new office, beneath the soft amber lights stretching over the quiet streets below, I realized I no longer felt anger, not because I had forgotten what they did to me, but because it no longer had any power over me. I was not working to get even, nor living to prove a point. I was living simply because I no longer wanted to lose myself again, and perhaps that calm was the clearest preparation for the turning point I was about to face. The True Value Project had entered its second phase, marked by an invitation to collaborate from a global media conglomerate. They wanted to adopt Canvas's model of community storytelling into their worldwide campaign network. I knew this was the kind of opportunity every independent agency dreams of, but it also meant I would be stepping back into the very arena I had once been cast out from. In the list of regional content partners, I saw a name I could never mistake, Collins and Partners, now temporarily overseen by a board of new shareholders, had submitted their bid to become the content production agency for North America. Ironically, they now had to compete with Canvas directly, stripped of their old home field advantage and boardroom favoritism. I felt no excitement, only clarity. This final battle would not draw blood, would not be a dramatic confrontation, but it would be the truest test of value, the very thing I had pursued since the first day I entered this industry. I spent weeks preparing the proposal for the final presentation round, not because I believed that being good guaranteed victory, but because I refused to fall back on the old belief that effort alone would be enough without learning from the past. I carefully studied every scoring metric, each line item in the budget, and the methods of presenting data while preserving the storytelling identity that had defined Canvas. I met again with David, who was now serving as strategic advisor for Canvas, and asked him a question I had avoided for a long time. If I lose, will I lose faith again? He smiled and simply said, "You're not doing this for anyone else's faith anymore." The presentation day took place in a bright, minimalist space, without stage effects or theatrical lighting. I sat across from a panel of 8, including representatives from the conglomerate, investors, and independent media partners. And across the table sat Heather. She never once looked at me during the session, but I saw every shift in her expression as Canvas presented our approach, how we combined data and emotion by using real stories to inspire action instead of pressure consumption. We didn't boast about million-view campaigns. We shared a handwritten letter from a child to a brand after watching a video we made for their old school. We didn't talk about growth rates. We spoke of how many people came back to the campaign site, not once, but 2 or 3 times, just to relive the story. The panel didn't nod, didn't smile. They simply listened intently. And I knew that this time, results would not come from emotion alone, but from the way emotion had been shaped into long-term business value. 3 days later, the results were emailed to all candidates. I opened my laptop before sunrise, my chest empty. And then, with just one line, I knew everything had changed. Canvas had been selected. Collins and Partners was eliminated in the final round, with the assessment stating the proposal lacked practical relevance to today's social landscape. I didn't feel joy, only a prolonged silence in my heart. It was as if all the noise that had lived in my mind for years had been erased with one quiet, full stop. But the story didn't end there. That same day, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. The voice took me a few seconds to recognize. It was Jason. He asked to see me one last time, saying there was something he had never had the chance to say. I thought long and hard about it. In the end, I agreed not to hear an explanation, but to confirm for myself that the things that once broke me no longer controlled me. We met at a cafe near the park, the one we used to stop at during breaks when working events in the early days. Jason looked worn down, the eyes that once gave me confidence now dull and guarded. He said he had known the documents had been taken, that Heather had used my work without credit, but back then, he thought staying silent would keep things stable because he feared a scandal would destroy the company his father had built. I was afraid of losing everything, he said, and in the end, I lost the only person who was never there for gain. I was quiet for a long time, not because I was moved, but because I finally understood that the deepest betrayal does not come from direct attacks, but from those who stood beside you and said nothing when you needed them most. I told him I was no longer angry, but there was no space left for him in my life. He nodded. That was the last time we met. I walked out of that cafe, feeling like I had finally closed the last door still left ajar in my heart. And just then, my phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. The media conglomerate had officially chosen Canvas as their global partner for the next 3 years, not just in the United States, but across Asia and Europe. They wanted me to be the keynote speaker at the Global Summit on building sustainable relationships between brands and communities. I looked up at the sky, now glowing amber as the sun broke through the narrow street. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, all the defeats, the ignored emails, the silent betrayals. But now, all of that had become the foundation for a new path forward. This was not revenge fueled by rage. It was revenge delivered through success, not to outshine anyone, but to reclaim the most honest version of myself. There was no applause when I stepped onto the stage at that international conference, only soft white lights shining directly onto the microphone in front of me, with hundreds of eyes silently waiting to hear a story without embellishment. I began with a very real moment, recounting the afternoon years ago when I left my old office with only a small bag and a great wound that I didn't know how to name. There were no accusations, no sensational details. I spoke with the voice of someone who had fully lived through the losses, long enough to look at them without hiding. The audience didn't stir, but I could feel true listening in the room. Because what touches the deepest part of the heart has never been the tone of the voice, but the depth of what remains unspoken. I didn't mention Collins and Partners in any part of my speech. but that silence spoke louder than any of the flowery words too familiar in the industry. And when the final line of the presentation appeared on the big screen, "True value never asks for permission to exist," the entire room stood up. I hadn't expected that, but I knew it wasn't applause for me. It was an acknowledgement of a way of doing things that had once been deemed weak, judged as not strong enough to survive in this competitive market. From that moment, Canvas entered a new chapter. Brands started coming to us not just for the effectiveness of the campaigns, but because they wanted to be part of something with depth. We didn't expand hastily or build extravagant offices, but the small office in Brooklyn became a gathering place for those who had been left behind by the old system, people who had been excluded from the game for being too honest, too sincere, or simply because they refused to accept a way of working that disrespected the human element. I entrusted David with the strategic development, while I stayed in my preferred role of creative content and community communications, the same position I had loved from the very beginning. Once again, I got to live with the work, but this time as the version of myself I no longer doubted. A Savannah who didn't need to force recognition, didn't need to suppress her pain to seem fine, and no longer feared losing anything by speaking the truth. On the other side, those who had pushed me to the bottom were beginning to face the consequences of their own making. Collins and Partners, after months of investigation, was forced to undergo a complete restructuring. Heather resigned amidst internal criticism and reports of power manipulation. Though she was not prosecuted, she disappeared from any industry events after that. Barbara Collins lost her seat on the board after multiple internal emails revealed she had personally influenced staff to serve her own interests. Jason remained at the company, but in a coordinating role with no real voice. Some say he often looked towards the 8th floor balcony, where I used to stand for hours contemplating my first campaign, but I didn't look back, because what had passed was no longer a place I needed to return to. I didn't see that as a victory. I saw it simply as a natural outcome when the truth is allowed to shine. One day in September, I received a message from an unknown number, no name, just a single line. "Thank you for not turning into them." I didn't know who sent it, but that phrase kept me sitting by the window for a long time, watching the sunlight filter through the old glass. Perhaps that's what kept me going through everything, not because I was stronger than anyone, but because I didn't let bitterness turn me into a version of those who hurt me. I learned that revenge doesn't have to win by destruction. It can be standing up through your own success, a calm return, but deep enough that those who once looked down on you are forced to look back, a quiet determination that makes those who've hurt you learn to face their own choices. At the end-of-year press conference for Canvas, a young journalist asked me, "If you could start over, would you want to avoid all the losses you've been through?" I looked at her, her eyes clear, as if still believing that life could be perfectly planned simply by staying on the right path. I told her I had no regrets. Because if I hadn't experienced the betrayals, the disregard, the being pushed out of a place I once called home, I would never have known how far I could go when I had nothing left to hold on to. I told her that sometimes the very things that cause us pain become the foundation for building a better version of ourselves, not to fight against anyone, but to live as authentically as we can. When everyone left, I stood alone in the conference hall, still holding the cold coffee cup in my hand. Perhaps the only thing missing that evening was a whisper from the past, but I knew that if the version of Savannah from those days could see me today, she would smile, not because I had been recognized, but because she would know that, in the end, I didn't need anyone else to lift me up to move forward. I just needed to stay true to myself when I was pushed away. And as the lights began to dim, I wondered how many people out there are in the quietest phase of their lives, just waiting for a reason to stand up. If they're listening to this story, I only want to ask one thing. Are you ready for a comeback? One that needs no prior warning, as long as you don't forget that true value always has its own voice.